From one of Australia's former leading homicide detectives, this is I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin.
I seek to hold accountable perpetrators within my own family, within my own community. But for some reason, that's frowned upon to do so because our perpetrators are also framed as victims of colonisation.
It could be said as an excuse, but your position, if I understand, is you want to break the cycle. It's got to stop somewhere.
Oh, totally. Look, human beings around the globe have experienced trauma and intergenerational trauma, if you like. So why is it that we allow it in some ways in the Indigenous community to prevent us from progressing as individuals in our own right?
I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin.
Today, I spoke with Jacinta Price. I think it's fair to say Jacinta is a controversial character. An Aboriginal lady who is a senator in federal parliament and has been the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs since 2023. Her views on Aboriginal issues often cause division, but as you'll find out today, she's prepared to stand by her comments. We spoke about her life and her views on a wide range of Indigenous issues. Let's see what you think about Senator Jacinta Price. Jacinta, I've followed your career for a long time. You're not hard to miss.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm all over the place. I can't even escape myself.
Yeah, and look, I think the type of topics you're talking about, and the areas that you're talking about, it's polarising. And they're difficult conversations that you have, and the position that you take on certain issues are always hard. I'm going to ask a personal question first up. What toll has it taken on you? And people would recognise you as the voice of the referendum on supporting the no vote and different stances that you've taken. What toll has it taken on you personally?
Well, there's a sense of not feeling like my life is my own, I guess. I know that my kids and my husband probably feel that I'm no longer, this sort of carefree, more relaxed person than what I used to be. And in many ways, sometimes they can see me as distant because my head is so full of what's going on, what the latest challenge is, the latest thing I'm trying to find an answer for, and those sorts of things. And there's that sort of sense of not feeling like my life is my own anymore.
I understand that. Do you have the ability to switch off when you can step away when you're with family and friends?
I do. I do. And sometimes, like, again, my family will say, your armour's up. You need to take your armour off. Go home and take your armour off. And it can be hard to get into that. But look, I love being able to chill out at home, be mum, copper roasting from my kids and my husband, be brought back down to earth again. It's my favourite thing to do.
It's good to dumb things down a little bit sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Where you pressure. Okay, this is my escape. I can be who I want to be. Yeah. There. Just on, there's so much to talk about. Congratulations on your book too. It's a interesting read. You've certainly lived a life.
Yeah, thank you. It's been an incredible journey and a very daunting at times process, and especially on the cusp of its release, knowing just how much of my life I guess I'd put out there for the public to learn about, and how thinking of how that might be received. As well but cathartic at times, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have been able to do it. Yeah.
Well, your public profile is very much linked to your Indigenous background, and quite often you're the person called in to make comments. Do you, when you speak as a Aboriginal lady, do you feel that you're speaking for all Aboriginal people, or you from your life experience?
No, definitely from my life experience. And that's a thing, right? I mean, it's a funny situation because when we look at other people, like we don't we don't see a white fella speaking and go, oh, they're speaking on behalf of all white fellas, you know.
Yeah.
But for Indigenous Australians, it's a funny sort of position because on one hand you're going, oh, you know, you've got your detractors who say you don't speak on behalf of me. Well, it's like, well, I actually never claimed to speak on behalf of you, but then you're told that, you know, if you're not saying what your detractors want to hear, then you're a sellout or you're a traitor. Well, so what is it? You know, am I supposed to be speaking on behalf of you or not? But ultimately, my lived experience and coming from being able to be the voice for those that want me to be their voice, those that don't get the opportunity to be heard, and really vulnerable, marginalised people that need their truth to be heard. That's really, you know, who I'm about speaking up on behalf of and for, in order to make a positive difference in their lives and to save lives, really. That's really what it's about. And let's face it, the truth is bloody confronting, but it's necessary to put out there to overcome our great challenges.
Well, we're going to break it down, the challenges and the positions you take on a lot of issues, but I can see the conundrum you've got there, that you don't speak for all of us, but if you speak, why aren't you speaking on behalf? And I'll chime in as the white fella at the table here too. There is a perception that, oh, well, you're Aboriginal, therefore you're speaking for other Aboriginals. And like, is it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but 250 different nations across the continent?
Well, yeah, look, I mean, in terms of language groups, that once upon a time there were over 500 languages spoken across the continent, and you know, there's like a handful still around now as first languages. But yeah, so we're talking different, you know, culturally, linguistically diverse people right across this continent at one stage.
Okay. Well, look, diving into, and yeah, we've got so much to talk about, your life, you're stepping into Parliament, your life as a politician, your thoughts on that world, which is probably more confronting than the Indigenous world in different ways, or more. But I think a good way to launch into it, your maiden speech. I've just pulled an extract out from the maiden speech. I'll read it through, and then we'll break down some things there, if that's okay. My vision, my hope, my goal is that we can effect change that will see women, children and other victims in these communities become as safe as any of those living in Sydney, Melbourne or any other Australian city. My goal is to halt the pointless virtue signalling and focus on solutions that bring real change, that changes the lives of Australia's most vulnerable citizens. Solutions that give them real lives, not the enduring nightmare of violence and terror that they currently live. It is not good enough that the streets of our Northern Territory towns and other towns across regional Australia have gangs of children aged from 6 to 16 wandering around with no adult supervision in the early hours of the morning. It's not good enough that almost all of these children have witnessed or been subject to normalised alcohol abuse, domestic, family and sexual violence throughout their young lives, and is the reason for their presence on our streets. Such neglect in great numbers would not be accepted in prosperous suburbs of any of our capital cities. Extract from your speech. You can't really argue with the sentiment there.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's true. Like, why Australia is an incredibly tolerant nation, but we can be tolerant to a fault, to the point that, you know, that we do have children as young as 6 to 16 on our streets late at night, at the early hours of the morning, that, you know, those circumstances continue in 2025. And when we contrast that and see a lot of people living in our cities, when they do visit places like Alice Springs or, you know, remote communities, there is a stark contrast in lives, in the way lives are lived, and in many ways it's a real culture shock as well. But this is just reality for us in places like Alice Springs and remote communities, and That's what needs to be better understood.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't excuse it. We should never excuse it. Or, especially when we want to, I seek to hold accountable perpetrators within my own family, within my own community. But for some reason, that's frowned upon to do so because our perpetrators are also framed as victims of colonisation. But that doesn't help the situation. So, again, it's about confronting reality and demonstrating to the rest of the country this is the reality of what goes on in these places where we experience the highest rates of marginalisation in the country.
Right, understanding that generational trauma, where it could be said as an excuse, but your position, if I understand, is you want to break the cycle. It's got to stop somewhere.
Oh, totally. Look, trauma is a human experience, and it doesn't discriminate. Human beings around the globe have experienced trauma and intergenerational trauma, if you like. So why is it that I guess we allow it in some ways in the Indigenous community to prevent us from progressing as individuals in our own right? Yes, we have to acknowledge it and realise that it's there and it exists, but we also have to acknowledge that we as human beings and individuals, without considering our racial heritage or anything like that, are capable of wonderful, great things. And we're empowered when we take responsibility, not just for our own circumstances, but when we take responsibility for how we are within our own families and communities at the same time. That's where empowerment comes from, as personal responsibility. But a lot of the time, the argument, the political argument is that we don't have to because it's colonisation's fault, and those that have stood to gain from colonisation are somehow also responsible. But we've all gained something from colonisation as much as it has played a part in the detriment of Indigenous Australians. There are also aspects that we have been able to progress forward from at the same time.
Pulling from the quote, the lives of Australia's most vulnerable citizens. You're referring in context, in full context, you're referring to confirming that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Sorry.
And I guess in that, talking about marginalised Indigenous Australians too, because, as I've always said, we're not just marginalised because of our racial heritage. There are some Indigenous Australians living very successful lives and a growing middle class, but I'm talking specifically about marginalised Indigenous Australians.
Okay, why can you offer, and it's a real broad question, and I'll warn you, I'm probably going to ask some dumb questions, but it's such
absolutely.
It's such a complex issue, and looking at it from the outside, and I've been involved in Indigenous matters, but I'm a white guy, and I never speak with great knowledge. I speak with experience, is what I've seen. But so if I ask some dumb questions, just cut me some latitude on this. But we'll try and get people across to understand exactly what we're
It's all about understanding.
Talking about the Indigenous community looked at as our vulnerable citizens in the country.
Well, in terms of our most marginalised, we experience the highest rates of domestic and family violence, of sexual abuse, of neglect, of all those things, the lowest rates of, education and lowest rates of employment. That's the most marginalised in this country are predominantly Indigenous Australians. And in my previous work as part of the Centre for Independent Studies, heading up the Indigenous Research Program, what we uncovered was that our most marginalised exist in regional and remote parts of this country, but particularly so, more acutely within places like the Northern Territory, Western Australia, and North Queensland, far North Queensland. And so for me, it's really important to identify who they are, which things like Closing the Gap report and all these initiatives don't necessarily prioritise the needs of our most marginalised, but take a blanket approach toward Indigenous Australians to suggest that we're all marginalised and just because we're Indigenous, right?
Yeah.
But and as I say, we've got to be far more focused and far more honest about how we approach that.
And that type of position, I would imagine, within the Indigenous community across the board, that might bring some conflict to you or some pushback.
It does, in that an industry has developed out of, Indigenous direction in Indigenous policy. There is, my focus is on, the figure of $33 billion being spent on Indigenous affairs was determined, I think, back in 2017, and we don't have a current figure on how much that spend is right now.
Yeah.
But as I said, it's usually spent on measures to support and advance Indigenous Australians, without saying, okay, but who are we actually looking at here? And so an industry has developed out of that. I mean, there are many livelihoods that have been created in that space. There are many organisations that are tasked with improving the lives of marginalised Indigenous Australians that, in my view, many of which are failing. But if I point these things out, I'm going to be targeted. If I want to take a more honest approach to this matter, I will be targeted, because there are those who are going to feel threatened by the fact that I'm pointing, it's not just governments that are failing.
Yeah.
It's those that are funded by governments that are failing, and there is very little accountability in this space. So calling for these things will naturally ensure that I have enemies.
And in calling that, and I'll just clarify it, the where the money's not going where it supposedly should go to, or people have, you've said creating an industry. It would not, and I'm guessing here, but it wouldn't just be Aboriginal people that are making a profit from it or creating an industry. So when you want it scrutinised, you want it scrutinised across the board, not just the money that's gone to the blackfellas. You want whoever's got control of this money and how it's being used.
Yeah, whoever's receiving funds that are supposed to go to improving the lives of Indigenous Australians.
Okay. You touched on, health, education, crime. What sort of figures are we looking at? Just and again, it's hard to generalise because we're going back into exactly what you've pointed out where we make mistakes, but it is known that the high incarceration rate, as an ex-cop, I know the challenges that, corrective services, the high incarceration of Indigenous people. Health is a problem. Education, employment, the welfare system, or relying on welfare. What if people that haven't really bought into it, tell them what we're talking about on the scale.
Yeah. Look, incarceration is a huge issue, but sometimes I feel like we try to deal with the symptoms and not the causes of the matter.
Yeah.
I can recommend a really good book by Don Weatherburn called Arresting Incarceration: Pathways Out of Indigenous Imprisonment, who headed up the Bureau of Criminology here in New South Wales for some time.
I'm aware of him and know him. Yep.
And basically he identifies that I think it's between 65 and 70% of incarcerated Indigenous men are incarcerated for acts of violence. And I mean, it's a horrible truth, but these are cycles, obviously, generational cycles. And my argument is that we need to address this particular issue, because if we address the violence issue, we'll see a dramatic decrease in rates of incarceration amongst Indigenous men. But also Indigenous women, this is increasing in terms of incarceration rates, the reason why Indigenous women are being incarcerated. And an argument that I've always put forward, which I still, to this day, I'll always get pushback on, is the fact that I know from lived experience that in places like where we have the highest rates of DV in the Northern Territory, is that in traditional culture, violence is accepted. But all small-scale societies on the face of the earth used violence as a means of social control. And for us in Central Australia, the frontier was not that long ago.
Yeah.
My grandparents first saw whitefellas in their early adolescence. So traditional culture that accepted violence as a means of social control is partly the reason why we have such high rates of violence, because men, women and children will act out violently because it's accepted in traditional culture. But also there are elements of traditional culture that suggest that women are not as important as men. You know, it's patriarchal society. And if we don't acknowledge this, we're not going to overcome the DV crisis that we're confronted with. And again, in the book, it's lived experience. My mother becoming a mother at, being pregnant at 13 and a mother at 14. And under those circumstances, it's questionable as to how that came about. She won't provide so much detail, but I don't believe that my mother was willingly, she was forced into a relationship with the father of my brother. Because in traditional terms, if you have a child to an Aboriginal man, you have to then, be married to that man in traditional terms. So there's those elements of traditional culture that play out significantly in the lives of women in places like the Northern Territory. And more broadly, they don't have opportunity to speak or have a platform, a media platform, or are often, if so, are too scared to talk about the reality of what goes on in communities. And then in the broader context, in Indigenous affairs, the narrative is that we simply blame colonisation for what's going on. And also, as I've been told, I shouldn't speak ill of our own people because that is supposed to then encourage racists toward us. Well, hang on a second. If we take it all back, what we want to do is stop people from losing their lives. Racism is the problem of the racist. It's their mental health issue to deal with. We shouldn't make it ours, right? Yeah. But what we should do is ensure that our most vulnerable, our women and children, are kept safe. And that is my argument. So if it means that we have to highlight the reality of the circumstances, if it means that we have to highlight in traditional culture we do accept violence as a means of social control, but that we shouldn't and have those hard conversations, then that's what I'm doing and that's what I'm prepared to do, and we should all be prepared to do that.
And saying that, when you explain it that way, it sounds quite reasonable. But the pushback is, well, you're disrespecting our culture, or this is our business. Things. I think in your book, your auntie that disappeared and suspected murder a long time ago, and that was a horrendous situation. But it felt, and I put my hat on as a homicide detective, that no one wanted to talk about it. And there would have been people that could have offered something and chose not to come forward because of the shame of coming forward.
Well, absolutely. Not just the shame, but probably the circumstances around it that my aunt's promised husband had already murdered and done time after murdering his first wife, but that under customary law, she didn't want to go to that relationship and be forced into it, and she was being forced into it. But under customary law, he had every right to punish her for not doing as was her obligation to do, was to go and be his wife. Yeah. And so those involved in that circumstance that were forcing her into that were also doing it on the belief that it was appropriate to do so. Yeah. And, the saddest part about that whole thing is that her father, who was a very prominent man, my mother's uncle, and, held up as a revered elder and a land rights activist and all those things, evidently knew what went on, but took that secret to his grave. And in that also told a story that she had run away, that she has had 8 sons, living in Queensland, has 8 sons. He ensured that story, made the rounds, which was part of a cover-up as far as I'm concerned.
People bought into it.
Yeah, that's right. Because why would you do that if you in fact your daughter's not really alive?
Yeah, it's a sad case, and I know you still hope to get answers. So good luck with that. I'm doing what you probably gets you into trouble a lot of times, because we're focusing on negative aspects of the culture. But let's say, and quite often I hear you talk about things like you've just explained there. There's a lot of positives about the culture, and there's some really, I can only speak from my experience, I've met some really, what I would consider good role models.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my book, I talk a lot about my grandfather and my grandfather's story, and I think my grandfather was a revolutionary forward thinker for a man of his time who embraced change instead of fighting it, if you like, because, he knew that life was tough. Before whitefellas came along, it was kill or be killed in terms of when you would come across your traditional enemies. You had to live off the land in a very harsh desert environment. And when this change came, he knew he had to be part of it, because it meant not just surviving but thriving. And my grandfather also, I guess I get it from him, where he pushed back on tradition, in that when he and my grandmother got together, my grandmother was already part of a polygamous marriage, was like a third wife.
Yeah.
And my grandfather and grandmother wanted to be together. And so my grandfather defied tradition. He copped it a couple of times and got a beating from the traditional promised husband. But in the end, he was able to then take my grandmother as his wife. And when he saw that my mother wanted to make her own choices and fought to have an education, he backed her up in that. He could have very easily said to my mother, you, while you've escaped your first marriage, and I wouldn't call it a marriage, you are actually supposed to be traditionally becoming a second wife in the marriage that your older sister's involved in. You need to go to that now if you're not going to be with this horrible, violent individual. But both my mum's traditional promise husband and my grandfather put my mum's wishes before traditional culture.
Okay.
To me, they're the kind of men that are, they're all throughout, and they're wonderful men who care and love for their families, and that's why I guess I've always celebrated my grandfather for that, for the man that he was and the love that he gave and the things that he believed in. And there are absolutely a lot of men like that. I know there are men that think much like I do, but for fear of retribution, they keep that to themselves as well, because men can also be targeted violently. Men are also victims of violence as well, good men. So, when people try to argue that I paint all of our men as horrible, when all I'm doing is looking at the facts, when all I'm saying is, okay, our kids are experiencing the highest rates of sexual abuse. To say that doesn't mean to say all our men are pedophiles. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And in terms of wonderful aspects about culture, I often share those as well, like the fact that, I was brought up by my elders to believe that if you are conceived on this country, because what we believe is that when you're conceived, your baby spirit has leapt from the ground into your mother's belly, giving you your personal dreaming, your connection to that country by the creator ancestor that created that country. You now are connected to that creator ancestor. That's your personal dreaming. So that anyone who's conceived on this country is also connected to this country spiritually in that way, regardless of racial heritage. That's the part of my culture that I love and I celebrate, which is about being completely inclusive and recognising others as human beings, not as people divided by race. And that to me is what true reconciliation looks like.
Okay. We've got right into the hard stuff without even finding out a little bit about yourself. So tell us where you were born, and what you were just relaying there. I was reading that in your book, and I found it fascinating. And about yourself, where you were born, grew up.
Yeah, so my parents were living on Melville Island when I was born. So I was born in Darwin, and a week after my birth, flew back to the islands and spent a few more months there. Mum and Dad were there for a few more months before they decided to move to the Kimberley. But given that my conception site comes from Tiwi country, and the Mangatobi family pretty much adopted us as family, I share, the dreaming spirit with Yirrkabay, Chickabanga, which is a crocodile dreaming clan up on the Tiwi Islands. And so, if I go back there and during ceremony participate and dance with the crocodile clan, that's my connection to the Tiwi Islands. My personal dreamings, my inherited dreamings coming from my Warlpiri side of the family are Ngapa, which is rain, and Warlu, fire. And so my responsibilities in Warlpiri country are around those Jukurpa stories, so around Ngapa and fire, rain and fire. But so Mum and Dad took another teaching job in the Kimberley in Nunkanbar, the community of Nunkanbar. Mm-hmm. So I was just a toddler when they took that job, and we lived in like a little in a caravan basically, in that didn't have very good air conditioning, and would live through the wet season and under really incredible conditions. Like I just sort of think I could probably never live in the Kimberley like that again. Now understanding, in many ways I can't remember because I was a toddler, but how Mum and Dad did that, and especially Mum being a desert woman, growing. By the age of just before I turned 3, Mum and Dad decided to move to Alice Springs, so a bit closer to Yuendamu, where Mum's from, a bit closer to family. And all my life I've been spent a lot of time out at Yuendamu. It was like a second home because all my family lived there. Spent a lot of time, we'd as a kid, we'd go camping. Like Mum and Dad would just pick up and we'd be going out bush or out camping, trying to find the next lot of rock art that Dad felt like he needed to go and discover, or going out with family and going hunting, and with my aunties and my grandmother and Mum and my cousins, just walking around barefoot, out on our country, and my auntie bopping 2 goannas on the head at once because they're mating, and all kinds of wonderful experiences. They're life skills
you need to know.
Life skills. You get 2 in 1 with that if you can come across 2 goannas like that. That was, and a lot of my family living in town camps around Alice Springs as well. So a lot of time in town camps.
And in the town camps, you would have seen the good and the bad. A lot of the bad, I would imagine. Yeah,
I have really happy memories too in town camps and just being with my cousins and stuff. And there's some really, it's certainly balanced with some really horrible memories as well. And seeing a woman in my extended family, her little boy running from her because she's completely drunk and emotional and got a knife in her hand, and my other aunties, grabbing hold of the little fella and comforting him while his mum's standing there stabbing herself in the leg. Experiences like that, experiences of, as I've mentioned in the book, getting up in the middle of the night and rescuing my family members from, drunken violence that's unfolding in the town camp.
Yeah, and that's so all those things are what's created the person you are now, I suppose.
Yeah.
When did you? And we're going to talk about your music career a little bit later. You're not getting out of here without that. We'll do that in part 2, I think. But what inspired you to politics? Yeah, I know your mum was very much in the politics and was a spokesperson and would offer opinions, and it come. Not always the popular opinions. That's a sense I get. What inspired you to get into politics?
Probably the fact that it appeared as though those in power have a clue as to what was going on the ground in communities.
Yeah.
And, that lived experience was being sugar-coated or ignored in many ways. And I think watching this Aboriginal industry flourish, but without any change occurring on the ground.
Yeah.
And also, I guess, knowing that there's some people who are perpetrators who are being revered as elders and thinking, why is that? Why do we do that? And we can't do that. How does that impact us positively? What message does that tell victims in our communities?
Yeah, well, you bring up a point, and I think one thing, and looking at, it doesn't matter which culture, which community, children need to be protected, and I think that's a no-brainer, and culture shouldn't override the protection of children. That's also picked up on documented talks or pieces about, and you've even said it here today, and I like that attitude that prevention is better than cure. So when we're talking about the crime in the streets and kids getting into trouble, what's your ideas of preventing that, like diversionary situations, like the high incarceration rate? I can talk here generally, but I know Northern Territory, it's how can we change that?
Comes down to the failures of the child protection system.
Yep.
And there are a number of different failures, I believe, in the child protection system. I'm just speaking in a committee just before, actually, about asking questions around the kinship principle and how that's been prioritised for kids, and this notion that culture and being connected to country is what should be the priority, whereas my idea of upholding the human rights of these kids to be able to live lives safely, not exposed to domestic and family violence and sexual abuse and having their needs met, that should be the priority. But I feel as though the ideology in organisations, child protection organisations, is that it's more about culture, maintaining culture, than it is about human rights. But then at the same time, there are failings in the child protection system that, regardless of all of that, kids are still not properly, their circumstances aren't properly considered, or there's potentially carers in the system that are doing wrong by these kids when they're supposed to be in that system to be protected as well.
Is there, and he will throw it in the silly white guy comments, stolen generation, that we all, the way it's portrayed, everyone carries shame with it and different things. One of the articles I read, or one of the speeches that you've given, you talked about, when you're talking about children, the kinship, it should override, the protection of the children should override it, where children are taken from one family and placed into another, or taken off a family that they've been placed into because they're not Indigenous, and to keep that cultural connection. I can see in an ideal world that would work, but you gave examples where it doesn't work.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is to understand that whole family environment. There are wonderful things about being part of huge Aboriginal families. The fact that there are so many that are prepared to take care of kids. In some circumstances, when it's grandparents, often they're overwhelmed and actually don't have the capacity to take on a lot of kids.
Yeah.
And in some ways, and in some circumstances, there are still connections with potential predators within families if kids remain in those circumstances. I'm also well aware of circumstances, particularly in the Northern Territory, where children have been put into foster care from when they're a baby, and then they're growing up in the suburbs of places like Alice Springs, and they might have special needs. They might be kids with FASD, and so all the health and mental health services available to them, specialist services available to them, are in that environment in the suburbs. And then they get to the age of 5 or so, and suddenly somebody who says that they are kin, who this child might not even know, like a complete stranger to them, living out in a remote community where there is no access to all those services that supports that child's upbringing, suddenly become the carer of that kid, and that kid is taken out of that environment that they've only ever known and put out into a remote community, in circumstances where there are known perpetrators in those communities and pedophiles in those communities as well. So those kids are effectively put back in the path of danger. And I know of circumstances where that's been done, and those children have been re-traumatised, and those children have been, abused once more, and then having to be taken back out and back with the original foster parents. Like, it's criminal to do that to that child in the first place. And my argument is that I don't care what the racial heritage is of the carer for that child. If that child is being loved, cared for, protected, and having all their needs met, then that should override any other decisions. I know of circumstances where some kin will put their hand up because they know that there is a monetary element to it, where they then have access to payments for that child, but they're not necessarily putting the needs of that child first. And I know also of Indigenous foster parents who are overwhelmed in their circumstances, but are doing a remarkable job as well. So for me, it's about ultimately the protection of that child it should always be the first priority. And, when I talk about foster parents, some of those foster parents have worked in the police force, in child abuse, on the front line. So they know who perpetrators are, and to be taking care of a child, for that child to be removed from their care, and they've done everything they can to fight the child protection system to say this is wrong, and yet it still occurs.
Looking at, I in discussions I have with Indigenous communities and just things I'm interested in, they talk about community-led government policy. They want the community want ownership in what's going to impact on them. I know that, and I might be misinterpreting this, but sometimes you're criticised for not believing in community-led solutions. But that's a misrepresentation. Would you agree?
I absolutely believe in community-led, because I think it's coming from the community. The community know what's going on the ground within their community, and empowering those organisations to do so is great. But as long as there are checks and balances, as long as they are demonstrating outcomes, as long as there is a level of accountability as well involved, as long as there's a number of recent examples of community organised, Aboriginal organisations where their member has a domestic violence history, and that there's excuses made for those individuals and their positions. So, to me, there's a lowering of expectations in Indigenous affairs and within some of these organisations, but governance is primary. It is so important, and if we don't get that right, how do we know that these organisations are delivering as they should? I think there should be freedom of choice for Indigenous Australians as well, because yes, we should invest in community-driven or Aboriginal identified organisations and those sorts of things, and that was another question that I put to the Productivity Commission today during the Senate hearing, was that, is there data that draws a comparison between Aboriginal community-led and mainstream?
That'd be interesting.
And there is no data.
Right.
There is no data. So while, it is good to have community-led, and I don't believe in the concept that only Aboriginal people know how to better support Aboriginal people. I think we're all humans, and I think as humans and part of a wider community, take for example addiction is a human condition, and that Western society has developed tools in order to help overcome addiction. And why wouldn't we draw on those tools, given it is a human condition, to be able to help all people, including Indigenous Australians, overcome those things? So I just don't believe in the concept that only Aboriginal people know how to help Aboriginal people, because then we'd just have Asian people just helping Asian people and white people helping white people, but we're all people ultimately.
Hear what you're saying, but I know those type of comments. Other people say we don't need to be told what to do. Some projects I've seen just in this local area. We're in Erskineville, but clean slate and tribal warrior. That was for. I've had Shane Phillips on the podcast before. I'm amazed by the work that they did, and this was when we're talking. Redfern was a volatile place, and there was a lot of crime and a heavy Indigenous population, and clean slate without prejudice and tribal boxing had some great results, and to this day they're still running a great organisation and doing good work. I see that from a cop or ex-cop's point of view.
Yeah, and look, I know some wonderful organisations like the Glen, on the Central Coast, and like BlackRock in the Hunter, doing amazing work to provide employment pathways for prisoners. They're absolutely wonderful programs that are demonstrating that they're providing outcomes and should absolutely be supported. And there's plenty of examples of that right around the country. Yeah. So I'm not. Yeah, I never suggest to discount one for the other, but we need a broad range of all of those. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just trying to understand, because I hear stuff that oh no, this is what she says and she means this. So breaking it down, the intervention that always gets people's opinions very very emotional about that. It was 2007 where it first started. What that meant to you as an Aboriginal person when that came in, and what your thoughts, because it ran for it was only stopped in 2022 or 2015, I think they had called it something else, but it ran till 2022.
So there's still some policies in place as a result of that. Stronger Futures, I think it was then sort of overhauled by Labor afterwards, and policies under that came from that initially. So when that occurred, it was like breaking the seal. It was like breaking the glass ceiling, if you like, because for so long we'd known about so many cases of abuse, sexual abuse in remote communities, and the Little Children Are Sacred report was smashing that wide open. Which led to the intervention, and a lot of people demonise it and say that it disempowered Aboriginal people, and a lot of the time, a lot of Aboriginal people and communities are told that they are disempowered by it, and power was taken away from them. But what they don't realise is that the Territory Labor government at that time broke down Aboriginal community councils, disempowered them, and created council super shires throughout the Northern Territory. And people get that mixed up with the intervention. That wasn't an initiative of the intervention. That was actually initiative, which in fact our current Minister for Indigenous Australians, Mullindiri McCarthy, was part of, and our current member for Lingiari, Marion Scrimgeour, was part of as well. So a lot of people felt disempowered by that change to the power structure in the Northern Territory. It took jobs away from Indigenous people in those communities when they no longer had their own councils, running their own councils. But the fact that, going back to the Little Children Are Sacred report, that was out in the open, it was like ripping a Band-Aid off a horrible festering sore, which needed to be exposed. And it empowered a lot of Aboriginal women in those communities to take more of a lead in that space as well. And, my mum was one of those women. There was all this pushback from activists saying this is all just about a land grab and all these sorts of things. And I was actually in remote communities engaging with in town camps when during the Gillard government, when they were delivering upgrades to those town camps, and what the aim was to try and bring those town camps to a standard where they were like suburbs around Alice Springs instead, which was about civil works, basic things like that. So these are all the sorts of things that came along at the same time. And no one realises that there were all these other elements that came to it. But as a family, we were like, thank God someone is prepared to actually take seriously what's going on in remote communities when it comes to the fact that our kids are experiencing these horrible rates of sexual abuse and that our women are experiencing rates of DV. And an interesting thing is, a year or so ago, I had a conversation with Mel Bruff. He rang me to tell me that he said one of the significant pushes behind initiating that intervention was that he received a letter from a young Aboriginal woman living in a town camp who wrote to him to say, each night I go to bed and I don't know if I'll wake up the next day, whether this is the night that I'll be murdered. And I've got a baby, and basically outlined the conditions that she'd been living in. And he described this young woman to me, and from her circumstances, I thought to myself, wow, I feel like that's my cousin, you know? And I said to him, do you remember her name? And he said, I'd have to go looking for it. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But I said, look, I'm going to go and have a conversation with my cousin. And I did. I rang my cousin. I said, hey, listen, you didn't happen to write a letter to Mel Bruff? And she said, yeah, I did. And I'm like, wow, okay. And her circumstances have changed significantly. And she is very sought after interpreter, and she does other wonderful work in the Indigenous space. And she got out of that situation, and her daughter is achieving remarkable things in her life now, and her daughter is 18. And the kids that come along are as well. So she escaped that. But I just thought, I was so surprised that was what part of that led to that as well. Yeah.
Back at it, can you explain, because I know with the people in circles I mix in Indigenous communities, there's a lot of people that were outraged by what happened there. Do you understand where they're coming from? Can you see their perspective on where they felt that why are we being treated this way? There was rampant sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Why wasn't there an intervention there? Comments like that come out. Do you understand where?
Well, I guess there has been an intervention, and recognition from the Catholic. A response to that, and there's been a redress scheme and all that sort of thing for those victims. So, I mean, that's the sort of thing that I'm calling for, right, when it comes to our kids. And look, a lot of the outrage was fueled by the activist class. There were a lot of truths being told about what was going on. People in community, vulnerable individuals who without a proper education can't disseminate what's real information and what isn't.
Yeah.
And so, there weren't there wasn't an army tank going through a community.
You're not suggesting the media misled something.
Oh my goodness! But that's the thing, right? People are going, "Oh, these kids, they're going to take away our babies, and they're going to do this," and they're whipped into a frenzy by those who should have known better as well. Like the army were there to help with health checks. They were supporting the community, much like what would happen if there was some kind of natural disaster when the army goes in, to setting up tents and doing health checks and those sorts of things. And why would you want to not allow for that to occur or to go ahead? And it wasn't designed to try and say that all Aboriginal men are pedophiles. Again, it's prioritising, it's going, how we goes to, let's protect our vulnerable, let's protect our children.
Yeah.
That's what I can't get around. Why there is such a need to take offence and be defensive, as opposed to go, this is actually about our victims and our vulnerable, not about anything else.
Okay, focusing on children becoming victims.
Yeah, absolutely.
At that point in time. Do you think, so it's from 2022, do you think the current Northern Territory is in a better situation because of the intervention? Because there's issues going on there now. Do you think it was a good thing or a bad thing with the benefit of hindsight, looking back at the history?
Look, I think it has. I'm not saying it was perfect.
Yep.
It has its upsides and its downsides to it, and the situation is that yes, Aboriginal people feel disempowered in communities, but there are other factors involved in that as well, and they're the sorts of things that I hope to address. You know, if I've successfully become a Minister for Indigenous Australians, it comes around empowerment through participating effectively in the economy, which allows for people to stand on their own 2 feet. And welfare dependency is a huge factor in why things aren't progressing out in communities. Wealth generation or inability to create wealth generation in communities is a huge factor. Again, just going back to this committee that I've just been sitting on, and the Productivity Commission have outlined that land rights and land and sea rights hasn't equated to better outcomes as yet. But the environment, the Land Rights Act that we're governed under in the Northern Territory doesn't necessarily allow for traditional owners to utilise their land for the benefit of economic development. There's no home ownership opportunities. There's no private land ownership opportunities, and we know that is what helps people to create wealth, to stand on their own 2 feet, to live comfortably, to ensure that their kids go to school, to create jobs. And I want to work toward creating that environment where traditional owners become job creators, not just have a job, but become job creators, so that they can participate in the economy like everybody else in this country has the opportunity to. And that's what we haven't got to yet.
Okay.
And when you've got mums and dads working, kids are more likely to go to school. Kids are going to get an education. But our curriculum needs to be such that it is allowing for kids in communities to be able to leave school and actually have the appropriate level of education to either go on to further to go into employment or go on to further education.
It's a vicious cycle if a family's been living in welfare, and it doesn't need to be an Indigenous family. If I've seen families where 3 generations of white fellas, and that doesn't create a good role model or an understanding of what life is about.
And can I just say on that as well, and like in my previous research findings is that the further away from a city, the more marginalised Australians become, and that's both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, because there is less of access to services, there is less availability of jobs and those sorts of things to be able to provide that, and that goes for everybody.
There's a region. There's problems within the city, like living within the city as well. But I agree. The services across the board, the more remote you go, the more difficult it is to match those services. We'll finish off on part 1. It's hard to find a question I can ask you that's not controversial. I'm looking for them. But I, in the introduction, I said that you've got strong opinions and you're prepared to back them. I'll ask one question here, just a general question. Just curious, if Joe Blow walks up, how are Indigenous people treated in Australia? What would you say?
Well, I'd say Indigenous people have incredible opportunity in this country. There are many people in this country who want what's best for Indigenous Australians. There's no country on the face of the earth that doesn't have its handful of those who have racist attitudes across the board. But otherwise, I believe that in general terms, most Australians want what's best for Indigenous Australians, and as I said, and governments have been bending over backwards to ensure that there is plenty of opportunity that is being provided for Indigenous Australians. That's what I'd say.
Okay, fine. We'll leave it at that. Let's take a break.